Hello and welcome back to Take Action News with David Shuster. Of course, as executive producer Daniel Marin's guest hosting once again today. We've been talking about the Zimmerman verdict, of course, that has shook the nation and perhaps shook the world. But we're going to take a brief break from discussing that. We're going to talk about that once again with Cliff Schechter in just a moment. But there was another issue related to racial equality that we've been covering closely on the show here on Take Action News. And of course, that's the Supreme Court ruling that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. Of course, the Voting Rights Act is the law that requires that states with a history of racial discrimination in their voting laws must report to Congress, to the Department of Justice, rather, what their laws are in a set of pre-clearance before they can actually get them approved. Of course, that provision is Section 5 of the law, but Section 4 is the part of the law that allows Congress to determine which states need to go through that pre-clearance process. And so, absent those requirements, Congress is now in a bind. They will have to redraft the law such that it establishes a pattern for pre-clearance that is actually considered constitutional. Now, I haven't yet introduced him on air, but of course, someone who's worked with me before, our very own Cole Stangler, he's a staff writer for In These Times, has been covering this topic, the Voting Rights Act, very closely. Cole, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here, as always.
Now, Cole wrote a story this week in These Times about the progress that some members of Congress believe that they are making on the issue of the Voting Rights Act to redraft that law so that it would meet these new constitutional requirements. Now, Cole, before I jump just right into exactly what you found in your reporting and get your take on that, I want to mention that just a few weeks ago, we had Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton from the District of Columbia right here on Take Action News, and she expressed some optimism. She said she was pleased to hear that James Sensenbrenner, the Republican member of Congress, who at the time was the chairman of the committee when they last reauthorized the Voting Rights Act back in 2006, indicated that he was committed to renewing the law, to revising it in a way that met the Supreme Court's constitutional standards. She then told David Shuster that she believed that the Democrats would succeed in renewing the Voting Rights Act in a constitutional fashion because she believed that the Republicans could be pressured and called out on their hypocrisy. Here's how she put it just a couple weeks ago on Take Action News.
I think that if there is enough pressure, reminding them of where they were and requiring that the burden now shifts to them to show why they have changed, I think it can be.
Now, Cole, of course, you spoke to many other members of Congress who, of course, many of them members of the Congressional Black Caucus, including John Lewis. He was a civil rights leader. What are they saying about the prospects of getting a new Voting Rights Act through?
All right, so to be clear here, we're still at a very preliminary stage. So this week, for the first time since the Shelby County versus Holder decision, you had members of Congress trying to come up with some preliminary hearings to get the ball rolling here on how they're going to address come up with a new Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. Because as you mentioned, Section 5 is still on the books. It's still considered constitutional, but the task of Congress is to come up with a new formula. And so there was a hearing earlier this week. There were actually two hearings. And so at this stage right now, it's still very preliminary. The idea basically is to come up with some sort of substitute for Section 4, and whether that's going to be geographic, as it has been in the past, which is mostly southern states that are covered by the old formula. It could be some sort of system where you're looking at specific changes in the voting system. So it could be something like voter ID laws. You have a set of voting changes that if any jurisdiction attempts to implement those changes, then that kind of would kick in the pre-clearance provision. So that could be something. It could be a mix of both. It's sort of still kind of very unclear at this stage. But I think it is significant that you have members of Congress that are starting to take up this task because when the decision came down in the Supreme Court, people rightfully were very upset at the fact that now they're kicking the ball over to Congress. We all know that Congress has a historic inability to actually pass legislation. This 113th Congress, it's on target to be the worst in that respect.